Having some career cravings? Need more spice and fulfillment in your career? Welcome to Career Cravings Talk Show with your host, Dev Ramcharan. Dev and his guests will guide you to achieve those career goals and dreams. Satisfy those cravings. Now, without further ado, meet your host, Dev.
Well, good evening, everyone from Toronto. I am with my guest, Beverly John, today, and we're going to go through another exploration of the experience and the learning that we are going to be able to glean from yet another successful professional in the list of guests that we've had over the last year. Beverly is with us in Ontario. So she's actually one of the few guests I've spoken to who actually lives in the same general region as I do, which is wonderful. And I'm going to now ask Beverly to introduce herself and to tell us about her career and some of its highlights over the last few years. And Beverly, take as much time as you like. Go in depth, explain to us. If I need to steer you in a different direction, I'll jump in at some point in time, okay?
Okay, thanks very much, Dev, and good evening to you and your listeners. And thanks so much for having me on the show. And thank you also, Dev, for giving me this opportunity to reflect on what my career path and my career journey has been like. So my career started out as a registered nurse. I went to college to learn to become a registered nurse. And the very first job I had was actually in the labor and delivery department. Now, I think everyone will know that it's very challenging as a new grad to get a position, a full-time position, without having any experience. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about this because I got into labor and delivery, which is a specialized situation, position, role. And the reason why I got into that role was after graduating from college, I got married, had my son, and that was before I started working. So I was able to, in my interview, explain to the interviewer that I had experiential knowledge. Not only did I have a theoretical knowledge, but I also had the experiential knowledge. And so without having that additional certification in labor and delivery, that additional specialization experience, I was able to obtain that job.
So let me stop you for a second. This is amazing. So you went into full-time work after having a baby, indicating that having the baby gave you the requisite knowledge to be able to work in a labor and delivery department.
Absolutely, Dev. I felt I have a theoretical knowledge, and whereas I didn't have a clinical experience, I had better than clinical experience because I had experiential knowledge.
That's marvelous. Absolutely. Keep going.
So from there, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time in labor and delivery. I learned a lot. One of the elements of labor and delivery was how to deal with emergencies. Okay, because babies can come quite fast and furious when they're ready. And sometimes they run into difficulties, and in those situations, you may have to perform a cesarean section rather than a natural delivery. And so that was the second progression in my career, that having worked in those emergency situations and having done several emergency cesarean sections, I then thought, okay, what's going to be my next career path? Because I thought as a new graduate, a young graduate, it was incumbent on me to learn as many of the different disciplines in healthcare as I possibly could.
Can I ask you another question? This is fascinating. So, look, Beverly, is it a standard thing today, all these years after, for an RN to be able to do a C-section, or is it doctors that do this, or other nurse. Gosh, the nurses that are actually doing some of the work that doctors used to do. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do, Dev,
Yes.
and this would be an assistant role. The
Gotcha.
obstetrician would still be the one that's performing the actual cesarean section itself, but you
Right.
do rely on nurses to assist with passing the instruments, the sponges, ensuring that the surgery really, really functions as it should.
Gotcha. But it
So
certainly feels as if you had some flavors of nurse practitioner activity going on when
that's
you were.
right. That's
Gotcha.
absolutely correct, because back then, believe it or not, this was many, many years ago. In fact, there weren't nurse practitioners around at
Yes.
that time.
Hmm.
So with that knowledge of learning to scrub and set up instruments and pass instruments and really functioning as a surgical nurse, the next phase of my career was, I thought, well, perhaps working in an operating room would be really interesting. But again, if you'd like to work in an operating room, you also need to complete a post-diploma course in operating room nursing. You need to obtain an operating room nursing certificate to get one of those roles. But once again, I was able to transfer the skills I'd learned in labor and delivery to the operating room. And so when I went for that interview, notwithstanding that I didn't have the postgraduate certificate, I was able to demonstrate that I had all the skills and knowledge of aseptic technique, which is working in a sterile environment, being very, very proficient in terms of working in an emergency situation. And so with that knowledge from labor and delivery, I was then able to obtain a job in the operating room. Now,
Okay,
the
so hang
operating
on.
room,
Let me interrupt you one more time because this, once again, is completely fascinating.
yes.
What you just described to me is something that I teach as an advanced practice as a career transition coach to
Mm-hmm.
individuals who are trying to cross over industries or cross over from a highly technical field that they
Mm-hmm.
currently might be in into one that requires just as highly technical qualifications in another field. And what
Mm-hmm.
you were doing without ever having had the coaching support or the
Mm-hmm.
training to do it is you were naturally adept at
Mm-hmm.
decomposing the elements of the role that you were already in,
Mm-hmm.
finding those elements that were actually applicable for transitioning to a different kind of role, and then articulating it with such precision that you were able to cross over into a role that you did not necessarily have the required certification or diploma for. That is amazing.
And that is absolutely correct, Dev. And that is all a part of it. Is so important to have goals in life and to have goals in your career. You've got to be able to see where that path will take you, and then ensure that the experiences you've had to be able to articulate them and to be able to transfer them to the new situation and to be able to do it convincingly. But of course, I mean, you're able to do it convincingly because you've actually got that experience behind you. So I was fortunate to get a role in the operating room. And what was even more fortunate was that it wasn't just a regular general hospital, but actually a hospital that provided tertiary and quaternary care. So again, working in an operating room that did a lot of trauma, and not just trauma, you had all of the major type surgeries in terms of cardiac surgery, neurosurgery, transplants, those elements. So I was able to obtain a position there, and in fact, I like to think that I really grew up in this hospital because I went in as a general operating room nurse, And then I transferred that general operating room nursing once more into a very specialized area, which was cardiac surgery. And cardiac surgery, you're working at a very complex and stressful level, if you will, because it's complex from the perspective of you're working on someone's heart. Every element of the surgery is critical. There's no point in that surgery where it's not critical, and you've got to be fully engaged at all times. As a scrub nurse, you have to be 2 steps ahead of a surgeon. As a circulating nurse, you have to be 4 steps ahead of the anesthetist and your scrub nurse and the surgeon. So you have to be incredibly engaged, and not just engaged, but you have to anticipate and you have to be prepared for all eventualities. Gotcha. So if the surgery goes well, then that's great. Everything goes fine. If the surgery does not go well, then you have to anticipate what's not going well and get all the necessary tools and resources that may be required to for that surgical recovery.
Gotcha. So look, I just wrapped up a contract with the Cardiac Care Network of Ontario. Mm-hmm. So hearing some of this background in cardiac surgery is it's quite amazing. So as a scrub nurse, you were 2 steps ahead of the surgeon. As a circulating nurse, you were 4 steps ahead of the doc, as well as the anesthetist.
That's correct.
So you found early in your career a real gift for managing complex circumstances, complex conversations, and high degrees of stress, such that that patient's life was saved ultimately, with you being able to cover it all, with all of the varied personalities of the clinicians you were dealing with, the levels of exhaustion they might have been struggling with, as well as those traumatic events that might have been occurring with the patient on the table at the point in time.
You have summed it up incredibly well, Dev. That's exactly what it was. You're absolutely correct. And you've said it so eloquently. And in fact, that's what led me into management.
Right.
Because dealing with the complexities and dealing with life and death situation, it then puts you in a position, if you're interested in moving up the career ladder, it then puts you in a position where you recognize you've handled these difficult, challenging life and death situations. And you recognize that anything else that comes along in your career path will pale in comparison to what you've dealt with in these complex surgeries.
Wow. So there's nothing that you really have ever been afraid of following that experience of those life and death circumstances.
I would say that everything pales in comparison, Deb, and I say everything pales in comparison because when you've got a patient on the table whose life is hanging in the balance, and everyone is working feverishly and furiously to save that patient's life, interpersonal dynamics, budget tensions, all of those really pale in comparison to saving someone's life. Because you know that you can bring other skills to the table, whether it's a budgetary issue, whether it's in interpersonal dynamics that you're dealing with as a leader. You know that you can bring different types of skills to that situation, to diffuse that situation, or to mitigate or to ameliorate that situation.
So you're in a circumstance. So you're in a circumstance where you're in an OR, and you're dealing with a patient that the doc is about to lose. Panic is setting in the room, and you are part of that surgical or that team that has got to find a way to sustain the life of the patient by rapidly assessing risks, options, approaches, and what you need to do to control the situation so that you save the patient's life. And I reckon you've probably done the same thing with the sustainment of organizations and agencies that you have worked leading or on a board for.
Absolutely.
Assessing
That
the
is
state of that patient on that table from a sustainability perspective to keep the organization alive. You've done the same kind of thing, haven't you?
absolutely, Dev. Absolutely. I after I moved into the management role, I can remember and know the situation as a manager. And in fact, I first became the manager of an operating room, and then I became the assistant director. But certainly one of the situations was there was another department in the hospital that had the highest percentage of complaints in the entire hospital. And so in addition to my role as the assistant director of that operating room, I was asked to go in and sort out this department that was literally a blemish on the good name of the hospital because of the number of complaints. And so I went into that department, managed it for a year, and at the end of the year, those complaints had pretty much all disappeared. And in fact, it became the department in the hospital that had the least complaints. And that was working in an incredibly collaborative way with the surgeons in that department, the nursing staff in the department, the ancillary staff, and most of all, the patients.
Okay. So more than likely, without lean processes having been sort of put into the healthcare system, you're already using the principles of it to get to the root causes and to address those root causes, working with the stakeholders that were involved closely so that they could be the source of truth about what was going on, where the delays and inefficiencies were, and what could be done to alleviate the overall situation. I reckon that's what you did as a leader.
And that's absolutely correct. Again, you summed it up incredibly well. That's absolutely what happened. It was incredibly, incredibly important to work with the stakeholders, all of the stakeholders, because they knew what the problems were, Dev. They knew what the problems were. Regrettably, they were unable to address the issues. So it took someone else coming in, someone who listened to them. Because in situations like those, Dev, the stakeholders already have the solutions. It's just how you bring everyone together to effect the best solution or solutions in that situation.
Yes.
And that is what I did.
And I get the sense too, Beverly, that though you would have been an extremely collaborative individual, you would not have suffered fools gladly.
Well, that is absolutely correct, Dev, because you have to collaborate, but at the same time, there are some times as a leader that you've got to exercise that authority.
Yes.
And especially when there's a certain desired outcome. First, you've got to ensure that everyone is aware of what the outcome is and why that outcome is needed and necessary. And then you work collaboratively with everyone, but working towards that defined outcome.
Gotcha. Lovely. And at the end of one single year,
Yes, it's
you had taken the Bad News Bears department and turned it around such that it now had the lowest level of complaints coming in about it.
It did. And that was, again, being respectful of everyone, listening to everyone, and involving the key stakeholders.
Right.
Yeah, because when you want to effect that sort of significant change and transformation, it's really important to identify the informal leaders
Yes.
and the legitimate leaders.
Mm-hmm.
It's really important to identify who they are.
Yes.
And work closely with them.
Yes. And when you were dealing with the surgeons, the doctors, and trying to work out how best to create an environment that might actually have a shift in the behaviors and the norms for the docs, what did you find yourself having to do?
You had to listen a lot. You had to be patient. Or I should say, I had to listen a lot, and I had to be patient. And I had to be respectful of their time, respectful of their sense of importance, and just be patient.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, be patient.
Yes. Yes. Good
Working
grief.
with them to identify what they perceive the issues to be.
Yes.
And at the same time, you had to be mindful of the fact that you did not want to negatively impact their livelihood.
Yes, yes. All right. So, Beverly, this is a fascinating story that is unfolding before us. It's really fascinating. Now, you came from the Caribbean to Toronto. I want you to walk me through what it was like to be a woman coming from the Caribbean, a woman of color, coming into the healthcare system at the time that you came into the healthcare system. Give me the time.
I've got to correct you with that. I was a child of color when I came.
Gotcha. But
I actually came as a teenager and went to college.
Gotcha.
So I completed high school in Jamaica.
Gotcha.
To the level of grade 13. And then I came and went to Ryerson, and Ryerson at the time was a polytechnic. It hadn't achieved the university status, but
Yes.
Having said that, the nursing program was modeled after a university program. We still had to do the requisite numbers of semesters,
Gotcha.
as the university program did.
Gotcha.
And we had very little time off, as a matter of fact. So certainly coming from Jamaica as a teenager and coming to college here, what I found was very different. Certainly huge cultural difference.
Yes.
And I say a huge cultural difference because I still talk about this. In Jamaica, everyone is Jamaican.
Yes.
Whether you're from African heritage or Southeast Asian heritage or Asian heritage or Anglo or European, everyone's Jamaican.
Yes.
So one of the things that struck me as the strangest, and I could not understand it, was when others in my class would say, oh, I'm Ukrainian Canadian, I'm Italian Canadian, I'm Russian Canadian.
Gotcha.
And it just did not make sense to me. I mean, it absolutely did not make sense to me because I thought, how could you be that? Why aren't you Canadian?
Yes.
And this was before multiculturalism really became what it is today.
Gotcha.
So certainly that was very different for me,
Yes.
but quite a good learning experience. And I can also tell a really funny story, Deb, because back then, and again, we're talking about in the 70s, Pearsons were not very popular, but I came from an all-girl high school where, the majority of us had had our ears pierced twice. That was just one of those things we did. I mean, I came from an all-girl high school.
Yes.
And so it was really interesting when all the girls in my class would say to me, oh, you've got your ears pierced. I mean, does that mean you're a princess or... or does it mean you're very special? and that to me was really strange because I thought, no, this was something we did.
Yes.
I mean, Jamaica tends to be on the leading edge for a lot of cultural type or sociocultural type elements.
Yes.
So that was certainly strange for me. But one of the other elements as we talk about being a person of color, and of course, I mean, you're coming from an environment where everyone is relatively equal, and I say relatively equal, where really you're not experiencing any sort of difference because you're all Jamaicans. So coming into the situation, one of the elements that happened to me that really made no sense, and in fact, I probably would not even have been aware of it if the other white students in my class didn't point it out, and that was, how was it that I had A's during the semester, but at the end of the semester or at the end of the academic year, I would end up with a B on some subjects. And they would say, how come you ended up with a B? You had all A's. And I would say, oops, I have no idea. I have no idea why that happened. So certainly that was just some of the systemic type racism that occurred that, you know, you just couldn't get an A even though you were deserving of an A. But again, you know, I was a teenager. I had not experienced any sort of racism and would not even have been able to voice that as an opinion or a reality. To me, it was just a situation that, okay, I guess that perhaps my final paper was not as good as what was expected, why I would end up with a B. And especially if the final paper, you know, was worth only about 20% of the year's grades.
Yes.
So certainly that was very different, but you know, I did not have a chip on my shoulder. I did not wear my race or my gender on my sleeve. And so I thought, well, okay, I've got a B. That's fine. It's not going to hold me back from doing what I need to do. So certainly in that period of time, I mean, I graduated and graduated well. It was not an issue. Everything went along quite well. And as I said previously, I graduated, got married, had my son, and then went into the workforce. And have never looked back from then. So certainly at all times in my career, working in labor and delivery, which was pretty specialized, working in the operating room, working on the cardiac team again, which was highly specialized. And I must tell you, Deb, that there were not a lot of women of color working in the operating room, except in the ancillary services, which was either as the ones who did the cleaning up or the washing of the instruments. Okay, they were very few. So certainly that, again, was to be noted. But one of the things I can say about that is these women who were working in the ancillary situations, they made me feel really good. They were so proud of me that, you know, I was an RN and I was an OR nurse. I wasn't one of them. So there was that informal support being given by these women.
Wow.
Which was quite rewarding.
What a lovely, lovely thing to hear. So, you know, it's funny because, you know, as with all things, as history and things change and social mores and social norms tend to change, there's sort of an ice-breaking trailblazer generation that goes through and cuts a path for generations that come after. And I think there's inadequate comprehension among those that come after for what it was that were the challenges that faced the generation that went before them, the trailblazers. And my father told me the story about being a student in Manitoba, in the University of Manitoba, where he had definitely been downgraded with his grades because of the fact that he was who he was, and had that experience, which harmonizes with the story that you just shared about the A's at the beginning of the year, all the way through until you got bell curved down into B's at the end for some unknown reason. But the response to that level of adversity is what then demonstrates the power and the grace and the generosity of the character. And as you described yourself, what you indicated is that you did not go forward in your life with a chip on your shoulder with respect to your race or your gender. You just continued to strive for excellence, powerfully and courageously, taking on challenges that continued to push you in a direction for further and further growth and development, to then become someone who was now working with an executive mind that could be used to have an even larger impact with respect to organizational growth or development or the profile and credibility of an organization. Would you say that's the case?
And that is, again, correct, Dev. That is absolutely correct, because all of these experiences, the early experiences, whether they were clinical, whether they were social, whether they were educational, all of those lent itself to my moving into management and into a senior management role. They certainly did, because the elements that you've talked about in terms of having the courage, in terms of having the conviction, in terms of having the humility, in terms of not ever allowing yourself to be minimized or diminished in any way. I think it's really important, because at no time did I ever think or believe that I was less than anyone else. And at the same time, I was well aware that I was a minority. I was well aware of that folks would always look to the majority when interacting. Certainly there's stories I could tell, such as being, let's say, on a patient care unit where I'm there as the manager. I can talk about this from being a manager, and having a patient's relative come along, and in fact they would address their question to the unit clerk, where I, as the manager, would be standing at the desk, but they would address their question to the unit clerk, who was white. And the unit clerk, with grace and aplomb would say, "Oh, you need to speak to the manager. Here she is, Miss Beverly John." And of course, me, the relatives, immediately would become quite embarrassed. But for me, it was just a lovely smile and, "How can I help you?
Yes.
What can I do?" Because I felt that with my interaction or my reaction, that person was already embarrassed. And being embarrassed was good enough for me. Because it said that perhaps they've learned a lesson, and perhaps next time when they're in that situation, they will first ask, who's the manager, rather than assuming that the person of color is not the manager.
Yes.
So certainly there are stories like that I can tell, but at no time did I feel diminished or minimized about it, Dev. And I didn't, because I thought, you know what, it's perfectly natural for you to address a question to someone who looks like you rather than someone who doesn't.
This is particularly important and relevant today, given the experience that people from different cultures are having in North America, based on some of the stereotypes that are out there and the kinds of controversies that we've had in the media and in provincial and federal politics over things like the wearing or not wearing of a hijab, for instance. And all of these things bring with them a cachet of assumption, stereotype, and cartoon characters that the people really have to think hard to get through, and the people who suffer the impact of these sorts of notions and perceptions have got to have the courage and the stamina and the strength of character and will to work through and past to demonstrate the excellence that's in.
You've absolutely got to, Deb. You've got to live your life without apology. Mm-hmm. You've got to stand strong with your convictions. Know who you are. Know what you're about. Know where you're coming from and where you want to go.
Excellent. Excellent. So look, we've talked about you now moving into management. Tell us about some of the rest of the career journey that you've been on up to this point in time.
Mm-hmm. So from there, as a manager, I had done a lot. I talked about transforming that unit that had the complaints. Other elements that I'd done as a manager was part of the building and moving off the operating rooms, and we're talking about multiple operating rooms. We built just around about 19 new operating rooms, moved a program from one hospital to another. So I'd done all of that, and I thought, okay, what next? Time to move on and do something else, time to move up a career ladder. And so I wanted to become a director because that's sort of the natural progression. You're a manager and you move into an assistant directorate role and then a director. And at the same time, having said that, Dev, with all of that, I'd also been back to university. I had gone to York and completed an admin studies degree, and I'd also gone back to U of T and completed a graduate degree. So armed with that additional knowledge, I thought that I had the experiences of managing folks and managing a huge budget, and so I could move into the director's role, which would then give me a larger portfolio. Because certainly I thought if I can effect change, and rather than effecting change on one unit, but now across many units and across a program, then that would be really worthwhile as a career goal. So I moved into that directorship, and fortunately for me, I am able to work with a very diverse group of folks. In fact, I think any leader is more successful when they have a diverse group of folks reporting to them, because you have a richness of discourse and dialogue in any of the situations with which you're faced, because you will have multiple inputs that's not necessarily the same. You haven't got a whole lot of folks saying yes to you or saying what they believe you would like to hear. You are getting true, honest input and responses to the situation, and diverse responses that you can then deconstruct to then effect the best response and the best solution to whatever the issue is, or whether it's planning, or whether it's being visionary, or even for that matter, as a director, you can have a vision that you can then take to your managers to determine how best to effect that vision. So being a director allowed me to do that, and again, I enjoyed what I was doing as a director. I absolutely enjoyed that, and I was actually tapped on the shoulder to become an interim VP, which was quite a surprise to me. I was absolutely surprised because I loved what I was doing as a director, but certainly as the interim VP, clearly clearly the president and CEO recognized something in me that I wasn't aware that I had. So certainly I did that job, and to all accounts I did it quite well. And you may say in terms of, well, why didn't I apply for the job on a permanent basis? And that's because I was having a lot of fun as a director. I was making some significant changes to some of the departments, and those changes were unfinished, and I wanted to see them through. But regrettably, the VP they hired, it just didn't work out. So again, I was tapped on the shoulder to now move into the permanent role, and that's how I became a VP. But again, it was that recognition that I was able to bring departments that were not up to standard. I was able to work really collaboratively as a member of the senior team. I was a new voice at the table that brought fresh eyes to the table, and fresh eyes that were appreciated in terms of what I was seeing in the organization and how to work with the other members of the senior team to make the necessary changes that were required elsewhere in the organization.
Right.
So certainly, again, for me, it was the ability to now effect change on a broad scale. And not just that, I mean, it was all the mentoring that occurred, Dev. That was the part of the job I would always say was my favorite in terms of being able to mentor staff. Whether it was an RPN to move into the baccalaureate program, or whether it was an educator who had her baccalaureate but did not have her graduate degree, to encourage them to obtain their graduate degree, or whether it was a manager who only had an undergrad who was then encouraged to return and get her graduate degree. So certainly the mentoring was just tremendous. And also the fact that, notwithstanding that I was the VP, whatever patient complaints that came to myself or came to the president, I dealt with them directly. I did. I did not shirk from that responsibility and pass that back to the managers. Certainly, there was always a response from myself to any of those correspondences or calls that came through. Mm-hmm. And again, I was helped in those situations by my whole philosophy of servant leadership. I really felt that none of this was about me. It was really in terms of what did I have to contribute and how could I make the lives of others better than what it was. Mm. So that has been my philosophy as a senior leader, and it's a philosophy that I still employ, having moved away from the hospitals and now working as a CEO of a community support services sector organization. Certainly, that philosophy has helped me to lead the organization, to transform the organization from being a very sleepy, laissez-faire type of enterprise to one that is highly respected. It's grown within the past 5 years. It's grown nearly some 400%.
Yes.
And I think it's been quite the journey.
Okay. So
good journey.
You have had an incredible journey, Beverly. I'm going to ask you now that last question that we ask all of our guests, and that is this. You are at your retirement party, and people are getting up to talk about who Beverly John was and what Beverly John was to them. What would you like to hear on that day?
I believe I would like to hear that I made a positive difference. I would like to hear that I was a visionary and not for side, just a visionary, but one who was able to work collaboratively with everyone to execute and achieve that vision. And I would like to know that folks believe that I treated them with respect, that I listened to them, that I walked the talk, and that I was there for them. And most of all, I was there for the vulnerable population we served, whether it was clients in the community or patients in the hospital.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Look, Beverly, it's been absolutely wonderful speaking with you. It's been a fascinating career, full of moments and descriptions that are inspiring to the people that have been listening, especially, I would say, the younger audience members who need to have people that they can see worked through obstacles, who pushed through adversity to be able to deliver the kind of change that you've been able to deliver in your career. And from what you've described, that you want to be someone who is known as having made a positive difference. If your career were to stop today, you could already say you've absolutely achieved that. That you were a visionary, well, you've achieved that. You had to be a visionary to be able to envision in your mind excellence out of some of the mayhem and chaos you entered into as you did your role as someone in management, senior management, and executive leadership, and also now as a CEO with a nonprofit agency. And as far as being someone who was able to work with everyone to execute and to advance the vision that you had, well, that is demonstrated in spades in the work that you've done and the career that you've had to date. And finally, treating people with respect is something that clearly you have done. You cannot have gotten the kinds of results that you've gotten in your career working with the people you have worked with without having an incredible gift for interpersonal depth, empathy, high emotional intelligence, which would then have affected the degree of loyalty and the willingness of the people who worked with you to go over the top in order to execute a vision that you had shared with them. How do you feel about all of that?
Dev, when you reflect it back to me, it sounds awesome. It sounds like someone else other than me. Again, when you're in the thick of it and you aren't exercising praxis, you just don't stop to think about it. Again, as I said, I come to the roles with tremendous humility, so I don't stop to think in terms of what the impact is on myself, so much so as the impact on others.
You know, one of the great things about this show is it gives people at a stage of life where they have lived deeply in the world of careers, it gives them a sense of the sharpening of the legacy that they want to leave behind and have a good number of years or a few years ahead of them to be able to work to achieve. And so, if anything, one of the things I hope you will have accomplished in this conversation is clarity around the change that you are in the world to make, so that you can make it on an even larger and more powerful scale as you move forward with this stage of your career. I want to thank you very, very much for being on our show. It's been wonderful to have you. Do you have any last things you want to say to the audience before we move to our second segment?
And thanks very much, Dev. Thanks very much for having me on the show, and thank you very much for summarizing all the elements. The only last thing I want to say is do set goals. Goals are very important. And find a mentor And that mentor could be anyone. It's really important to not remain static or stagnant in one's career. It's really important to feel at the end of the day that you've had the best day that you possibly could have had and that you made a difference to someone that day.
Excellent. Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much for being with us. So now we're going to move to our second segment. So now we've had the opportunity to speak to an absolutely polished professional, a woman who has dealt with adversity in her career, who has moved through all the different stages with grace, with vigor, with humor, with a significant amount of self-reliance and confidence, often confidence in the face of opposing stereotypes or perceptions of what her capability might have been or not have been. And she was the kind of individual who could move past all of these things, focusing her eye on the goals that she had in mind that she wanted to achieve. From the earliest stage of her life, Beverly John was a highly articulate and very, very persuasive negotiator. She had the wit and the acuity of mind to be able to go straight into the role that she wanted to take on, to imagine what its requirements were, and to then decompose the role she was already in such that she could find those areas of similarity and be able then to make a tremendous case for transition from where she was to where she wanted to be. That is an absolutely profound gift, and it's something that has to be worked at and developed over time. Beverly used this gift to her advantage from role to role to role. We'll remember that story with a smile about the experiential knowledge that she had of actually having a baby and being on the table so that she could build the argument for moving into a labor and delivery department. And she won it. And it wasn't the only time she had done it. And I reckon it's something she has done in one way or another, finding her way to the core of complex issues, complex circumstances, to be able to determine root causes, possible options and outcomes, and a way to be able to find her way to those outcomes, those results, those significant goals that she was able to envision. She's a woman of high self-discipline, and at the same time, she's all about performance and results, warmed and tempered by compassion and a deep sense of empathy and engagement with the people that she works with, under, around, and serves. She's learned throughout her career the importance of conceiving of herself as a servant leader. It's never been all about her alone. She's been highly ambitious, and that ambition has driven her from one level to another all the way through her career. But there's always been a wonderfully humane, balancing component to her personality, one which has been all about deep care, deep concern, deep respect for the people that she has worked with and around. And that's in evidence in her love for mentoring and for coaching. She sought out mentors early in her career and has used them all the way through. But I reckon that Beverly has been more of a mentor to people than she was ever mentored in her life, because it's in her DNA. It is who she is as an individual. She's also the kind of individual who accepts the unusual in others, who's able to work with extremely diverse groups, who takes people as they are, sees them with absolute clarity, celebrates and understands even those quirky aspects of their personality, so that ultimately she can leverage those things to achieve the goals that she needs to be able to achieve in deep collaboration with those people. The two earrings, the double piercing, is a little bit of an indicator, a clue to a part of her personality that is about proudly expressing who she is as an individual and being unafraid to accept and be proud of who she is, but likewise a willingness to do the same and extend that same graciously to others with whom she has worked. It's not easy to deal with doctors. It's not easy to deal with surgeons. You've got to realize they're coming from a context from their early childhood where they are the special child in their family, the one who became a clinician, a surgeon, a doctor, whatever the case may be. Now, when you get a large group of those together, you have a very complex culture to manage and to manage in. And Beverly was completely adept at working with that level of complexity as she worked with the complex organisms, which were the organizations, the hospitals, the clinical care, the ORs, the operating divisions and departments that she worked in and managed and progressed through. She's the kind of individual who is absolutely concerned about making valuable change wherever she is. It was difficult for her to extricate herself from the director level where she was having a ball, having a wonderful time driving change. But what she came to realize as she was moved or punted into the executive suite, having done it on an interim basis, was that the change she could achieve was on a grander, broader, more strategic scale, and she was gifted and adept at doing that likewise. And then finally, what Beverly has done with her career now is to move with all of that bag full of instruments, of talents, of knowledge, of wisdom, of people savviness, of all of the characteristics that have made her such a rich and wonderful example of leadership in the world she has found herself in, to build and to develop, to grow the mandate of, and to bring in the structure and the discipline required to take an agency from its earlier and sometimes extended entrepreneurial and shoot from the hip, live with no process stage to something that's more mature, more structured and orderly, and ultimately more productive than it ever might have been without the kind of compassionate but firm and no fooling around care that characterizes Beverly John. She has never suffered fools gladly in her career and throughout her life, and she doesn't do that now. Though she's full of compassion, warmth, care, and concern for the people that she works with, she realizes lives could be at stake. An organization's life could be on the line. The sustainability of a patient or of an agency is of equal importance to her, and she will do what she has to do in order to make sure that the patient or the organization survives, grows, and flourishes so that when she moves on, she can look back with a sense of pride. This is a woman who can, in fact, look back on her career with an incredible sense of accomplishment and a tremendous sense of pride in the people she has impacted and the people that she has touched. I have no doubt whatsoever that that conversation that she wants to hear at her retirement party is something that she will hear. And if she were to ask friends today, they'd tell her those things right now where she is. Beverly sets an example for us of perseverance, of focusing on goals, and of pushing through obstacles to achieve them, leveraging every talent, every gift, every relationship, every conversation, every opportunity for collaboration in order to achieve results worth achieving. That is the best that it could be. And for us, for me, for you, it will have been an honor to have spoken to her today. I want to thank you all for listening into this program, and I hope that you, as I have been, were inspired by what you heard and inspired to give the best that you can give, to live up to that kind of standard so that you can have a satisfaction of the deep career cravings that we all have today. I'm Dev Ramcharan, signing out from Toronto. All the best to you. Talk to you soon.
Well, that's our show. Thank you for joining us here at Career Cravings. Tune in to our show in 2 weeks, same place and time. We wish you the career you deserve. Until next time.